All right, welcome to our third lecture, and today we are going to get introduced to the general theory of ecological communities. But before I get there, I first want to talk a little bit about stuff. Just stuff. In general, I think there's actually fairly general ways in which stuff moves in and out of our lives. First of all, we can lose stuff. Happens to me all the time. That I just leave something somewhere and then it's gone forever. So losing stuff, fairly common thing. We also constantly replace stuff. So we might find that, something we have is not really good enough anymore and we will replace it with some other stuff. Then, of course, we can just acquire stuff. Fairly common thing to do. We order something on Amazon and it shows up, and thus we have acquired stuff. Or we can also create stuff. So, for example, we can do some arts and crafts with $92 of supply to recreate something that costs $7, and thus we have created stuff from scratch. So, in other words, there are technically two different ways of getting stuff. First, by just making it appear. Second, by creating it. And there are two different ways of removing stuff. We can lose stuff or we can replace stuff in a more deterministic way. Now, we can actually put some fancy words on these things. So new additions, transformed items, involuntary loss, deterministic replacement. And thus, we actually have what I call the general theory of stuff. Now, you might look at this and say, wow, he's completely off his rocker. This is clearly garbage. You might very well be right. But let's just shelve this one for now and maybe, conclude that it wasn't the greatest theory of all time. And talk about population genetics. Population genetics is a wonderful field because it basically underpins our entire understanding of evolution and evolutionary biology. And population genetics is so great because it has a really nice general framework that underpins everything we understand in population genetics. And that is essentially based on four really high-level processes. And these high-level processes are genetic drift, natural selection, migration, and mutation. Now I'm just going to go through these. None of those are rocket science. They're fairly straightforward. But it pays off to actually be very familiar with it. So let's talk about genetic drift first. So genetic drift is essentially a chance event that removes certain alleles from a population. So in this example here, we have some black and some white beetles that carry different types of alleles, and due to some chance event, only the three white beetles here with the lowercase aa alleles reproduce, leaves offspring, and therefore in the next generation, that's the only allele we have, and the capital A allele has been removed from the population. So that's genetic drift, fairly straightforward. You just lose alleles due to chance events. Natural selection is a more deterministic process that leads to the differential occurrence of alleles at some future time point. So in this example, again, we have the dark and the light beetles, and the dark beetles are better adapted to their environment because they're on a dark environment. So the lighter birds are more often spotted by birds, and thus you have fewer survivors, and that changes the frequency of different alleles in the population. The next one is migration, and that one's plainly obvious. You might have two different populations that carry two different sets of alleles, and one individual may choose to migrate from one population to the other, and thus their alleles move with them, and you have successfully changed the composition of alleles in your target population. And then finally, mutation is the spontaneous occurrence, completely random, of a new allele in a population. So we might have a population that has only lowercase alleles, lowercase a alleles, and then through reproduction, a random mutation converts one of these alleles to an uppercase, and thus we have a new genotype in the new population, and we have again successfully amended the composition of alleles in that population. Now this is the general theory of evolution. And as you may see right here, it is essentially very similar to what we just talked about earlier. We have new additions that come in through migration. We have transformations that come in through mutation. Then we have involuntary loss, which is drift. And we have deterministic replacement, which is selection. And that sounds a lot like my general theory of stuff. Now, of course, haters gonna hate. Don't bash the theory just yet. It might still get me a Nobel Prize. No, I'm just kidding. Obviously, I've modeled this after the general theory of evolution. But it goes to show that, you know, we can have some very broad, very general processes that really explain a lot that's going on in a complicated field such as evolution. Now, unfortunately, community ecology ain't so lucky. Because unlike population genetics, this is a great quote here, unlike population genetics, ecology has no known underlying regularities in its basic processes. That's rough. And you've seen this so far in this course as well, you know? We have all these different drivers of community assembly, such as the modern coexistence theory, theory of island biogeography, neutral theory, macroecology, and so on and so forth. It's sort of the piecemeal theories that try to explain certain phenomena, but nothing really seems to provide the overarching, super general framework of processes that govern how ecological communities assemble. And that's a bummer, because that would help us a lot if we had that. And it's no surprise that we don't, because just look at a system such as a coral reef and think about all the different possibilities that, you know, may interact and be at work here to shape this community of fishes. We can try to break it down, and that's what we're going to do in the next few slides. So we might start out with a community in which we have just 2 coral reef fishes. And the first thing we can do is a new species that arises due to speciation. So for example, over millions of years, one species splits into 2 due to ecological speciation, and thus we have added another species to the pool. We can add some species, and we can add species through something like dispersal. So they're moving from one population to the other. We might then also have, now that species might go extinct because we have a chance event. So we are removing a species from the community. And then because some species are just better adapted to thriving in that particular reef system, we might have selection as an operating force that changes the composition again and removes a fish species from the community. So we can go through these iterations from, our community of 2, we add through speciation, we add through dispersal, and then we take away through drift, and we take away through selection. And that gives us an equation that looks like this, where this number of species at time point 1 is the number of species at time point t, plus speciation plus immigration minus extinction, and extinction here is sort of compartmentalized into 2 different components, drift and selection. And that sounds an awful lot like the overarching processes in population genetics. In fact, if we break this down, we have the exact same processes occurring, but instead of occurring at the population level in terms of alleles, they simply occur at the level of species in a community. And that's the theory that Mark Valland proposed in a paper in 2010 and then formalized in a book in 2016. And really the main difference between this rock solid tenet of population genetics and this new theory of community ecology is that one of them is based on alleles and the other one is based on species, but the processes actually remain the same. And we call them slightly different. So in community ecology, our two processes that add are called dispersal and speciation versus migration and mutation. And our two processes that take away species, they're called very similar: drift and selection. Where again, drift is the chance, random component that happens to stochastic events. And selection is the more deterministic component that happens because of ecological drivers. So, even though this theory is seemingly simple, it obviously can't explain all the complexity that occurs in a system such as a coral reef. So think about, for example, the competition between two species of fish. Think about predator-prey relationships. Think about limiting similarity, niches, fitness, the effect of disturbance on certain species but not others. So there's a whole lot going on. But the good thing is that all of those actually go into one single process, and that is called selection. So we have all these theories and all these sort of lower level processes that essentially have to do with species' capacity to adapt and thrive in a certain set of conditions with a certain set of predators or competitors or prey species. But they're all under the umbrella of selection. And what we're really interested in at the highest level are not the causes of selection, they're the consequences of selection, right? So what's really interesting to us is whether or not a certain species will disappear due to one of the processes, in this case, selection. And the really nice thing about this whole theory, as I hope I've made clear now, seeing as there are 3 different examples, including my very compelling theory of stuff, that this general theory basically applies to almost everything that is self-replicating. So it actually applies to things like languages. It applies obviously to population genetics. It applies to social media platforms on the internet. So every time you have anything that self-replicates over time, this general theory kind of works. You have 2 ways of adding things, 2 ways of taking things away, and thus you have 4 general processes that structure your system of choice. Okay, now with that being said, we are going to focus on our 4 ecological processes and their occurrence in marine community ecology. And we're going to start with what I always think of as the simplest one, which is drift. Now, drift is essentially purely stochastic. It is a, completely random process that depends purely on probabilities. And these probabilities are generally shaped by a species' chance of survival. Now, chances of survival are really difficult to determine. But let's just say for this exercise, for the sake of this exercise, we have 2 species in which one has a chance of survival of 0.5 and the other one has a chance of survival of 0.4. Now you would say which one is more likely to survive? Well, the answer is fairly simple. Obviously, it's the one in the green, but the percentages actually aren't all that convincing. So, for example, random stochastic events can really influence this outcome. So, in this scenario where we only have 2 individuals of each species, then there would essentially be a 25% chance that both individuals of the species on the left would die. So that's, 1 out of 4. In turn, there's actually a 64% chance that at least one individual of the species on the right would survive. So probabilities give us an expectation, but they don't give us an outcome. And that outcome is most profoundly shaped by one parameter, and that is the number of species in the population. If the population is small, then things are in trouble. If the population is large, then these probabilities of survival are going to play out a whole lot different. Now, here's again our example. We have 2 different species and both have a population of 10 individuals. Is that a particularly realistic population estimate? Nah, probably not, but let's just roll with it for the sake of this exercise. So both species have 10 individuals in the pool, and again, you have these probabilities of survival of 0.4 and 0.5, which you can see right here, the peaks of these curves. Now, the sad truth is that both of these species have a fairly good chance of going extinct from this population, right? There's fairly high probability densities right here at the 0 mark, which is the number of survivors. So if none of them survive, don't be surprised. Essentially, this is like thinking about a coin flip. So you flip your coin 10 times, and there is a chance that you might flip 10 heads or 10 tails. Is it the most likely of scenarios? No, absolutely not. But there is a decent chance that it could actually happen. Now, in turn, if you are increasing that population to 1,000 individuals, you still have the same survival probabilities. Then there's absolutely no chance that any of these 2 species are going to go extinct. As a matter of fact, if you flip a coin 1,000 times and you flip 1,000 tails or 1,000 heads, boy, you're not playing with a good coin, right? So it's pure probability, and the number of individuals is the most critical ingredient for ecological drift. We can look at this in a 3-species assemblage as well, and that'll make clear how the number of individuals, especially over time, becomes this crucial force. So let's start with these 3 individuals, 3 species in this community. All of them have 20 individuals to begin with, and they have the exact same probability of survival. They're all at 0.5, right? So if we go through our first generation, it's not unrealistic to have some of these numbers. So for example, the orange species here only ends up with 4 survivors, which means 4 heads or 4 tails out of 20 coin flips. The green one ends up with 16 individuals, and the blue one ends up with the exact probability that I went into, which is 10 individuals. Now from there, things actually get quite sticky quite quickly. So now our orange species right here actually has a really low probability of survival, because it starts with only 4 individuals and has a 0.5 probability of survival. We're actually ending up with only 1 species, so 1 out of 4 coin flips essentially was the right one. The blue one also ends up with only 2 individuals, whereas the green one still ends up with 16. And then if we turn the clock a little wider, we will find that, for example, the orange species and the blue species will have gone extinct, and the green species is the sole survivor and will persist in the community. So again, I think this is a really powerful demonstration of just how much of a role the number of individuals in a population plays for ecological drift. Now, one sort of more philosophical take on ecological drift. I'm basically saying this is due to, complete chance event, random events that occur. And randomness or stochasticity is a concept that obviously is not super well defined. And you can probably argue a lot of things when it comes to randomness. So, for example, I could envision, a population of an animal or plant living on the side of an active volcano. If that volcano erupts and gets rid of, that population, then that's a very serious demographic event that, in my books at least, would be due to randomness or stochasticity. But one could obviously argue that, volcanic eruptions aren't all that random. They happen fairly predictably, and the species simply wasn't adapted well to survive in this environment. So there's a bit of a gray zone here. Same is true for, some of the more anthropogenically driven extirpations of species, for example. So this squirrelfish right here ended up being removed from the population because it was needed for a study. And so that species, just in an extreme scenario, might be taken away from a community because some scientists need this species for their research. Is that completely random? No, it isn't, because it's very deterministic. But in terms of the grand scheme of things, it is a fairly stochastic and random, so to speak, process. So I would definitely count it as an event that occurs due to ecological drift. Now, bottom line here is ecological drift takes away species from a community on a fairly random or stochastic, with a fairly random or stochastic dynamic. Okay, that's the first one. The next one we will talk about is dispersal. Now, to talk about dispersal, we first have to make a case for what is dispersal and what is not dispersal. So, for example, on the left here, we have a humpback whale, and humpback whales undertake these massive migrations that take them from the tropics of Hawaii to Antarctica or the Arctic, and they do that every year. That is not dispersal because they're not actually establishing new populations anywhere. On the other hand, on the right side, this is an Acroneurus larvae, a larval surgeonfish, and that larval surgeonfish will spend a long time in the plankton. Eventually, it'll come back to a reef, settle, and establish its life there, and that is dispersal. So the species in this case, traverses a certain environment and ends up in a new environment where it establishes a population. Now, of course, if a humpback whale was to serve as a vessel for a clownfish and a surgeonfish, spits them out in Sydney Harbor, and they establish a population there, then that would also be considered dispersal. Okay, so when it comes to dispersal, there are some major differences between terrestrial and marine ecosystems. You might ask, but why? And the answer is that the vast majority of marine animals have a stage in their lives where they're purely meant to disperse. So you might say, oh, well, that's the same for, birds and mammals and whatnot in terrestrial ecosystems. Surely their offspring has to, leave the nest at some point and establish a new population. But the bottom line is that those offspring are not designed to disperse, right? They may leave the adult territories and establish a territory down the road somewhere, but they're not meant to really go very far. On the flip side, these little machines right here, these are larval stages of various marine organisms, and they are absolute beasts, right? They actually, have the capacity to traverse these vast distances in the open ocean because they're made for the open ocean environment. And so as adults, they actually have to undergo this metamorphosis to, be better suited for a life, for example, in a coastal environment rather than the pelagic environment. So it is very clear that these larval stages are meant to disperse. And because of that, the effects of dispersal really are quite magnified in the marine environment compared to terrestrial animals, at least. What's one of the other reasons why that is actually possible in marine environments? Can you think of it? So the two media that offspring have to traverse in marine versus terrestrial environments are air versus water, right? And water, being a lot denser than air, actually does much better sort of carrying particles. So it makes sense that especially salt water is really good at dispersing animals as well. So that's part of the other reason why we see such an important role of dispersal in the marine environment. Okay, so in the very simplest scenario, we have dispersal as a process that connects two communities. And that allows these communities to interact and exchange species, right? So essentially, we're going from a single community to what we call a meta-community, right? In this case, we have 6 different communities that might interact, that might exchange, where animals may disperse between these reefs. And that can get quite complicated quite quickly because there aren't all that many boundaries in marine ecosystems, especially if you consider these larvae and the perks of the marine environment for dispersal. Meta communities in marine environments can get quite large very, very quickly. And that can be a problem because it can make things very complex. So if you think about a place like the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, which has about 3,000 individual reefs, they could all be connected somehow. So trying to track down how dispersal affects some of these reefs becomes nearly impossible. But let's not overcomplicate things just yet. Let's just start with the very simple effects of dispersal on some of our first order properties. So in the simplest scenario, high dispersal will increase local species richness or alpha diversity, right? So if we have a system that is well connected, has a lot of dispersal towards it, we will probably see an increase in alpha diversity. At the same time, high dispersal, if we're looking at several communities, will probably reduce community dissimilarity. So if we have lots and lots of connections between different communities, lots of exchange of species, there's a good chance that all these communities look very similar, and we would see very low beta diversity, which, if you remember from last lecture, is the turnover of species, the difference in species among multiple communities. And that's great, and it would be great if it were that simple. However, it is not, because those effects can also become quite complicated quite quickly. So if, for example, we have a species that is just a stupendous competitor and will outcompete just about anything else, then communities that have high influx of species through dispersal may actually end up having lower alpha diversity just because there is a follow-up effect beyond the dispersal that creates lower diversity. In this case, this species outcompeting the other species. And variable dispersal among communities may actually enhance beta diversity. So if some communities receive a lot and other communities don't, then we would expect beta diversity to go up. Now that's the ugly face of dispersal, quite literally so, because look at this little guy. But at the core of all of this, dispersal always adds species. They're coming in with the current, they're coming in to establish new populations, and therefore dispersal is a way of adding species to communities in a somewhat deliberate way, right? It'll depend on the community's properties, it'll depend on the species properties, but we're always adding species. Which leads us to the third process in the general theory of ecological communities, which is speciation. Now, speciation is obviously one of the great marvels of our planet, and it typically happens when a certain phylogenetic lineage establishes a new line of species in a certain environment that is fairly removed, that is fairly unoccupied, and it results in these what we call radiations, adaptive radiations. Some of the most famous ones are the cichlids in African lake ecosystems, or of course Darwin's Galapagos finches in the Galapagos Islands. So those are, prime examples of rapid speciation, and where speciation clearly over a relatively short period of time has shaped the communities that exist in these environments. Now, again, these were both terrestrial / freshwater examples. So you can take a minute just to brainstorm, hey, where are our marine adaptive radiations? And the answer is, well, there really ain't that many, or any really, that we know of. And the reason, you may probably guess, is because marine systems are generally very well connected, and it's hard to sort of get that isolation and that scenario where a lineage essentially establishes a completely new dynasty in a largely unoccupied ecosystem. As a consequence, speciation probably plays a little less of an overarching role in shaping marine communities at this day and age right now, and across those timescales that we often are interested in. Now, obviously, this depends on scale. So speciation, don't take this as me saying speciation doesn't have a role in shaping ecological communities and marine environments. It does. It just depends on scale. So, for example, if I'm looking at amphipods in a local seagrass bed, so I might go, to 3 seagrass beds in my local estuary, and I want to compare the communities of amphipods, that speciation is very, very unlikely to play a role in the dynamics of these communities. If I'm looking at seagrass beds within a region, so I might look across a couple of seagrass beds around an island or a couple of islands, we're probably still not seeing a whole lot of speciation contributing to these regional community properties. However, if I'm looking at seagrass beds worldwide and I want to compare amphipod assemblages across seagrass beds worldwide, then speciation most certainly plays a role, because there are most certainly some regions in the world where we would expect amphipods to have speciated much more rapidly in those seagrass beds than in others. So in this scenario, speciation is likely a force to be reckoned with. Now, sometimes some species will kind of break those rules a little bit. So these guys on the right here are pygmy gobies in the genus Trimma. These are tiny little coral reef fishes that display something that was called extreme microallopatry, which has resulted in what has been called a cornucopia of species in this genus. And essentially what happens is that these species seem to have abandoned the old way of life of having their larvae disperse into all four corners of the wind and then establish new populations elsewhere. So we're hypothesizing that these fishes right here, these species, actually have very restricted larval dispersal, and therefore they were able to speciate, or they speciated at scales that most other species would not speciate. So the scales of very, very small islands within an archipelago, for example, where you then end up with a new species of trimma in just about every little remote reef. So that obviously results in very limited distributions ultimately, but genus Trimma is a great example of vertebrates in which speciation most definitely plays a role at a relatively limited spatial scale. Now, one quick word on the analogy here. So far, drift and dispersal were very, very similar to the general theory of population genetics. With speciation, we're sort of hitting a little bit of a snag. So those two aren't fully equivalent. With mutation, which is the equivalent from population genetics, we have this completely random and spontaneous process, right? Where in a single, discrete, spontaneous event, we see a mutation that introduces a new allele into a population and therefore forms a new genotype. With speciation, it's a little less discrete and it's a lot spongier in terms of how that process actually unfolds. And it also occurs over these massive timescales, right? So it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over millions, thousands, or sometimes millions of years. The two main ways in which speciation occurs in communities are either through allopatric or sympatric speciation. That's basically a fancy way of saying, are these species spatially separated or not? So allopatric speciation means that somehow a species becomes spatially, a population becomes spatially isolated from another. And over time, because of that spatial isolation and the inability to interbreed because of that spatial separation, you end up having a new species in a new place. Sympatric speciation is a little different, although sometimes those two are also really difficult to disentangle. So sympatric speciation happens without spatial separation and is driven by sort of ecological divergence. So some individuals in a population might start specializing on a certain resource or niche or microhabitat or whatever, and over time they drift apart enough to force reproductive isolation between those individuals, and then you end up with sympatric speciation. Now you might say, well, isn't it easy to tell, because if they occur in the same place, then it's most likely sympatric speciation. Well, that would be really nice if that were the case. Unfortunately, it isn't, because even when we have allopatric speciation, which happens through spatial separation, there's a good chance that somehow they all end up back in the same place. And one genus where that has almost certainly happened is the genus Eviota, which are your dwarf gobies. They're very near and dear to my heart. But in Eviota, we have evidence for both allopatric and sympatric speciation. But they didn't occur in any kind of predictable way. So within these lineages of Eviota, we sometimes appear to have seen spatial separation and then mixing afterwards, which resulted in two species occurring in the same place. And then sometimes there seems to be ecological speciation as well, where we have no evidence for an allopatric process or a geographic barrier that would have induced that new species to arise. And in this particular genus, this all happened really rapidly during the mid-Pleistocene, about 150,000 years ago. So these are all very young species. And because they're so young, they give us a little more material to work with. So tracking down speciation can often be really hard because it happened such a long time ago, and all we're left with is, different species and their genetic signatures, from which we can infer a lot, but it's always going to be just inference based, right? Now, probably the best group of biota on our planet to study speciation are your microorganisms. So microbes are obviously working on very different time scales, and in those microbes, speciation probably has a much bigger role than in some other communities, just because it happens so fast. But the bottom line is, speciation always adds species to the mix. There's no way speciation will sort of result in fewer species. It adds species out of thin air, basically by transforming one thing into another and adding to the community through that. Which leaves the last, the messiest, but also probably the most interesting one, which is selection. Now, I've already mentioned that selection is basically an amalgamate of all these fine scale, nitty gritty ecological dynamics that we've talked about and that are so near and dear to our hearts, and that many a theory has been written about. But what we're ultimately interested in are the consequences of selection, right? Now, what I'm going to try to do today is I'm essentially going to try to introduce a way to look at selection in a slightly more structured way than we have done so far. Now, when we hear selection, we often think about Darwin and his finches, right? The theory of natural selection. That's not actually necessarily where I'm going at with this. It's obviously part of the equation, but it's not the center of this theory. What we're really talking about is selective forces on populations. And the quote here is that selection is the operation of selective forces on populations which cannot be understood in terms of nor reduced to the principles of physics and chemistry. And this applies to evolution, ecology, economics, genetics, social science, and medicine. And in other words, those are the soft sciences, right? Except they're not so soft. We can structure this and actually be a little more rigorous and precise in how we look at selection as an operating force in communities. What it all boils down to with selection is ecological fitness. So it all essentially hinges on what we think of as the expected quantity of offspring produced by an organism per unit time. In this case right here, it is clearly 1. And I'm going to spend the rest of this lecture to go through different forms of selection that we may observe and that are fairly generalizable across all different species. Now, to do that, we are actually going to talk about boobies. Boobies are these seabirds right here. You can see they look really dopey and cute and wonderful. This is a short video of a booby in the Galapagos Islands. They're feisty little birds and they breed on these exposed cliffs. They usually have one chick that they nurse and nurture. So this is called a Nazca booby in the Galapagos Islands, and really challenging birds that obviously feed on marine life surrounding these islands. And what we are going to do is we are going to work, just for this exercise, with two different species of boobies. There's actually several co-occurring species of boobies in the Galapagos, but we're just going to work with two for now. So on the left, we have the Nazca booby, and then on the right, we have the blue-footed booby. And the general dynamic in the Galapagos is that the Nazca booby is a competitively superior species to the blue-footed booby, so they can beat them up. They're a little bigger, and therefore can sort of compete for the better nesting spots. And the Nazca boobies generally nest directly on the cliff faces, so they have the prime oceanfront properties, whereas the blue-footed boobies get pushed a bit farther inland, a couple of meters away from the sea cliffs in the vegetation. And let's just envision a tiny island in the ocean where we have these two species trying to colonize an island. And in our scenario here, we have green and orange, and one of them might be the Nazca booby, and one of them is the blue-footed booby. Our 5 main forms of selection are constant selection, negative frequency dependent selection, positive frequency dependent selection, spatially variable selection, and temporally variable selection. Now, constant selection is fairly easy. So if we have constant selection and the Nazcas are competitively superior to the bluefoots, and they're competing for space, then what happens? Well, you would expect that if the competitive advantage is enough, the Nazca boobies would outcompete the bluefoots in any sort of circumstance and ultimately claim the island as their own. So in this graph, on the y-axis, we have the fitness of Nazca boobies minus the fitness of blue-footed boobies, and that means any positive value here means the Nazca boobies have an advantage, and any negative value here would mean that the bluefoots would have an advantage. And on the x-axis here, we have the relative frequency of Nazca boobies, right? So we're taking into account the existing population of these birds. That's not really important with constant selection because constant, as the name suggests, is constant. But it becomes important when we're talking about frequency-dependent selection. And in this case, negative frequency-dependent selection. Let's say the Nazca boobies are under negative frequency-dependent selection. How could that happen? If you're thinking about intra-specific competition, you're on the right track. So negative frequency-dependent selection is usually related to intra-specific competition for resources. So in this case, our graph would look something like this. So the fitness of these Nazca boobies would decrease as you're moving towards higher relative frequencies of Nazca boobies. So at the highest density of Nazca boobies, the the fitness advantage for that species has all but disappeared, and now actually the blue-footed booby has a competitive advantage. In reality, how would that happen? Well, you could think about, for example, very specific demands for nesting space, nesting material, nesting anything. And if there is higher intra-specific competition for these nesting resources among Nazca boobies than there is between Nazca boobies and bluefoot boobies, then you would most certainly see a negative frequency-dependent selection effect. Now, positive frequency-dependent selection is essentially the inverse of this. So essentially, you would gain a fitness advantage as your populations get denser. So in graphical terms, this would be what it's like. So at relatively low frequencies, the blue-footed boobies actually would have a fitness advantage, and at higher frequencies, the Nazca boobies would have a fitness advantage. Now, in practice, how would that happen? Well, you could, for example, think about a scenario where the Nazca boobies, their nesting actually changes the environment around them to be more suitable for Nazca boobies, and therefore, the more Nazca boobies you have nesting, the more of a competitive advantage they gain over the blue-footed boobies. And you would think, well, doesn't that then automatically result in extinction of the blue-footed boobies? And the answer is yeah, it probably would, but more on that in the next lecture. Okay, so there's a couple more forms of selection that I'm not going to go into in detail, but they're essentially spatially and temporally variable selection. What that means in less fancy terms is that as you move through space, the fitness advantage of one species disappears and may actually then become an advantage for the other species. So again, if you think of about this on sort of a landscape scale with spatially variable selection, you could think about an island where one half of the island is actually causing the Nazca boobies to have a competitive advantage, whereas the other half of the island, say the leeward side of the island, is more favorable for the blue-footed boobies, and therefore you have spatially variable selection that will allow for the coexistence of these two species on one island. And the same is true for temporally variable selection, where you might think about something like El Niño years, where one species has a slight competitive advantage over the other during an El Niño year, whereas the inverse is true during La Niña, and therefore both populations sort of coexist because their competitive advantage is mediated through time by environmental conditions. So these are the 5 main forms of selection: constant, negative frequency dependent, positive frequency dependent, spatially variable, and temporally variable. And I've basically, like a broken record, talked about species being affected by selection, which results in one species gaining competitive advantages. And you probably sat there and nodded in agreement and thought, yeah, but nothing to it. But in actuality, the selective forces don't give a hoot about species, right? They actually operate on individuals and their traits. And so the prime example to think about here again is that in natural selection, we have this scenario where a dark colored beetle in a dark environment is better adapted to the environment, and therefore doesn't get eaten. So it's clearly the traits actually that a certain individual holds that are usually constant within a species, but not always, that actually cause these effects, right? That give these fitness advantages to certain individuals, which then, ultimately may scale up to the species. And that leads us to a final sort of family of selection effects, which is trait-based selection. Now, these are blue-footed boobies, right? We also have red-footed boobies, and that is a wonderful example for trait-based selection. So we can play out a scenario of trait-based selection based on these two species. Let's just say the red feet give that individual a fitness advantage in one scenario, and the blue feet of the individual on the right give it a different advantage in another scenario. If we have constant selection operating on these traits, we would expect these traits to become more and more extreme over time through something called directional selection. So we might see that over time, these species express these traits in more and more extreme forms, leading to these bright red and bright blue feet in these two different species, just because they help them gain a fitness advantage. And we see that quite often. Obviously, these boobies are a great example for it, because why on earth would you have these stupid blue feet if it didn't convey some kind of competitive advantage? But it's also seen in other sort of groups of species. So think about, for example, a chiton living on an intertidal shoreline where the wave shear is just tremendously high. So these things have basically, their trait-based selection has driven them to be these flat animals that just do really well in a certain environment. Now, on the flip side, if there is selection for intermediate traits, which is quite possible, you would have something called stabilizing selection, where you actually are moving towards sort of the intermediate trait value on a certain for a certain trait. And that's how purple-footed boobies came to be. Unfortunately not. There are no purple-footed boobies. I wish they would exist, but they don't. But that's essentially it. The blue foots and the red foots are all we can muster in terms of booby feet. But ecological selection, therefore, always ultimately takes away species, right? So you can't gain species through ecological selection. If you're in a community and one of them has an advantage over the other, then, it's going to result in the disappearance. And that is the general theory of ecological communities: dispersal, drift, speciation, and selection. And there are 4 main processes. We have those 5 main, lower level processes that operate on selection. So constant, negative, positive, spatially and temporally variable selection. And that's it, folks. That's all we have. So as homework, I would ask you to briefly describe the 4 main processes: dispersal, drift, speciation, and selection, as well as the 5 main forms of selection, using your own words, also commenting on their role in structuring ecological communities. There's an example here. Don't copy that word by word. But yeah. And with that, I will see you next week.